how many people learn haiku in this country at least is not especially aesthetically well-grounded, using imagery and connecting and disconnecting narrative threads in such a way in a poem that they all can kind of make sense and commingle.
Can you give an example of a cut? What do you think is something that learning haiku can really help benefit Western writers?
Well, you know, I think that first of all, I have to ask, you know, sort of, what do you mean by learning haiku? Because I think actually how many people learn haiku in this country at least is not especially aesthetically well-grounded. So you can do the homework. I mean, you know, anyone can learn it. You know, it's just a question of whether you as a poet have done the homework, have done the legwork to read what you need to read and to read who you need to read. But once you have a sense for truly, you know, kind of the aesthetics of the genre, the Japanese aesthetics of the genre that were imported into English language haiku practice, and that have sort of made English language haiku kind of viable as a literary genre, as a genre of poetry, then I think you can understand that, like, for instance, the kire, or cut, in the middle of a haiku is really the engine of the poem. And if you expand on that idea, that cutting, you know, between juxtaposed images in a haiku really makes a haiku pop if the images juxtaposed are just so, you know. You can extend that idea of cutting into a longer poem, like what we would think of as, you know, kind of a typical English language free verse poem, and cut, like jump cuts in a film, you know, for instance, from one sort of family of images to another family of images to another family of images, or from one, and sort of create various narrative strands throughout a poem like that. And so that I did actually a fair amount of that in the last couple of poems that I read in the set. And I will also add that, you know, it's such this idea of cutting, what I'm calling cutting, coming from a sort of Japanese perspective here. You know, it's nothing new in English language poetry. I mean, I think the word that typically is used is disjuncture. You know, in English language poetry, it's nothing new. But I think there is a particular nuance to it. You know, if you apply that particular technique to kind of mainstream free verse poetry, that kind of really getting to know the engine of the haiku, getting to know how kire, how cutting works in a haiku, has vast implications for you know, using imagery and connecting and disconnecting narrative threads in such a way in a poem that they all can kind of make sense and commingle effectively in the reader's or the listener's mind.
To make this tangible for people that maybe haven't studied things beyond syllable count for haiku, which we know are that's how predominantly taught.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of a cut from either your poem or a poem that you've read that you're like, this is a prime example of how cutting works?
Let's see. That's off the top of my head. Like, sorry. I have my poems. I don't have my poems memorized. I can maybe the title haiku of my collection of haiku and short prose poems, A Silence or Two, I think has a very strong cut, and that poem goes: broken stars, deep in the sonogram, a silence or two. And so the cut is after the line broken stars, cut. And that points maybe in this direction, that image of broken stars, which itself is magical in a sense, right? You know, it points in this direction, cut. Deep in the sonogram, a silence or two, points in this direction. Do you know what I mean? So, broken stars, deep in the sonogram, a silence or two, and there's this cut in the middle, where your mind is going back and forth sort of between these two images, saying, how do they work together? You know, how do they work together? The first line isn't, you know, shining stars, because that's very real. it's broken stars, which is very, in a sense, unreal. So what are broken stars? It may be something unreal, in that sense untrue, but we all intuitively can understand what broken stars are. Do you know what I mean? Then there's this cut, deepen the sonogram, and that's something very concrete. We all have a sense for what a sonogram image looks like. Deepen the sonogram, and then the third line comes in, a silence or two. And that's where so it's sort of the poem really kind of turns. So there's this cut in between that enables us to connect the kind of unreal imagery of broken stars and there being a silence or two, which itself is an unusual and kind of impossible collocation, in with the broken in with the image, the sonogram image. So that's an example of what I would consider to be a pretty strong cut in one of my haiku.